Sussex down and out. Spotify officially put an end to Meghan after no episodes in Top 100. Meghan Markle has now released the final episode of her podcast, Archetypes. And overall, we bet that its relatively unsuccessful performance has made Spotify executives nervous. Spotify reportedly paid $32 million to sign Meghan and her husband, Prince Harry up, and while the first episode of Archetypes performed extremely well upon its release, it went to number 1 on the Spotify podcast charts in Australia, the US and the UK. The podcast's recent performance has been rather dismal. At the time of writing, Archetypes is sitting at number 63 on the Australian Spotify podcast chart, it's number 27 in the US and number 34 in the UK, and not a single episode of Archetypes in the Australian Top 100 of Spotify's podcast episode chart. Royal biographer, Angela Levin believes Archetypes is dull, and if she's not alone in that opinion, that could be a potential reason for Archetypes' poor performance. During a recent episode of GB News Neil Oliver, Live, Ms. Levin said she couldn't stand how Meghan presents herself as a victim in the podcast. Meghan seems to want to put everything about her in each of the podcasts, so it's actually quite dull if you've listened to several of them as I have, she said. You hear the same thing, that she's a victim, she's a victim, she's a victim for so many different reasons. It's the same thing about Meghan's truth, which is not necessarily the truth, Ms. Levin continued. The last episode of Archetypes marked the first time during the show's run that Meghan had males as guests, Andy Cohen, Trevor Noah, and Judd Apatow. Meghan did reveal during the episode that she was initially hesitant to have males as guests on her podcast. Now, if you've been listening to the past 11 episodes, you may have noticed that you haven't heard many men's voices. In fact, until now, outside a pop-in from my husband in the first episode, this show has featured exclusively women's voices, Meghan said. And that's by design. It was important to us that women have a space to share their authentic and complicated, complex and dynamic experiences. To be heard. And to be understood. Then Meghan disclosed that she decided to invite male guests onto Archetypes because of Prince Harry. But through that process, it also occurred to me, and truth be told, at the suggestion of my husband, that if we really want to shift how we think about gender and the limiting labels that we separate people into, then we have to broaden the conversation. And we have to actively include men in that conversation, and certainly in that effort. For the past 3 months, Meghan Markle has expanded her already long list of titles: actress, duchess, activist, by sitting behind the microphone as host of the Archetypes podcast. The project aims to investigate, dissect, and subvert the labels that try to hold women back, featuring mostly other famous women as guests including Serena Williams, Mariah Carey, Paris Hilton, Constance Wu, and Mindy Kaling. Archetypes became the #1 podcast in 6 markets, which included the US and the UK, when it first launched on Spotify, according to Variety. Since then, the podcast has tumbled on the Spotify charts, currently landing at the 17th spot for the US and the 32nd spot for the UK. Besides dropping in popularity, the show hasn't been without controversy. One royal expert claimed that the hidden motive behind Archetypes is to start a war against the royal family. Other critics pointed out that the Duchess of Sussex talks more than her guests on the podcast, a hosting faux pas, per The Sun. Then, Markle came under fire after guest Alison Yarrow hinted in an Instagram post that she was interviewed by a producer for the show, not the Duchess herself. Now that the first 12 episodes have wrapped, there are signs that the future may not be so bright for the controversial podcast.